everyone. Hi. So thank you for joining us today for this beautiful evening. My name is Ariana Williamson. If I do not know you, I'm the Black Student Union president here on campus. So we are going to have our ASWCU president, Luke, come up and read some acknowledgments for us.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name's Luke Deshane. If I haven't met you, I'm ASWC president. It's great to see some familiar faces, but if I haven't met you, I'd love to meet you, so please don't hesitate to introduce yourself. And yeah, I'll go ahead and get into the land acknowledgement and labor acknowledgement. Sorry, I'm reading off my phone. We had some printer malfunction, so just bear with me. But anyway. We acknowledge that we stand on land stolen from Native and Indigenous people, namely the Nimiipuu people. We recognize that they were the first people here. In 1890, Washington State University received 90,081 acres of indigenous lands designated to establish Washington State University. Washington State University retains the majority of these lands to this day. We acknowledge that the disposition of indigenous lands was often taken by coercive and violent acts in disregard of treaties. For that, we extend our deepest apologies. We owe our deepest gratitude to the Native peoples of this region and maintain our commitment towards reconciliation. We acknowledge that it is our duty to understand how we can better support indigenous communities in our ongoing work towards equity and inclusion. And now for the labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we all benefit, some more than others, from the prosperity of the United States, which was built on the labor of enslaved people who suffered from the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice. We must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. Please join us in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for the descendants of those people who played a huge part in the building of this country. Thanks.
Okay, so let's open up our Fireside Chat, Washington State Rising, with author Marc Robinson. So thank you for coming out. I would like to introduce our Simon Peter Frimpong, Kofi. He is an electrical engineering student here at Washington State with a focus on power systems. He has completed internships at Boeing, Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, contributing to computer vision and battery algorithm projects. As Chief Innovation Officer at Gerioff Accounting and Services, he improved business processes through automation. Frimpong leads the National Society of Black Engineers at his university and has founded a nonprofit organization. He is the first place winner in the 2023 Senior Design Competition and actively engages in international leadership forums, emphasizing his dedication to societal impact. So can we give a warm welcome to Kofi? Up next is our amazing, wonderful Amina Hassan. She is a junior studying political science with a hope of minoring in ethnic studies and also aspirations into being a civil rights attorney. She is an outspoken, intelligent leader, also our favorite fashionista. Not only is she our African Diaspora Association vice president, but she is also the co-founder and public relations officer for the brand new and strong organization, People of Color Pre-Law Coalition. And she is also the Black Student Union public relations officer. And last but not least, we're going to welcome our author. It is a pleasure that we welcome our MLK keynote speaker, Dr. Marc Robinson, a distinguished researcher, author, teacher, and alum of WSU. Dr. Robinson currently serves as an assistant professor of history at California State University in San Bernardino, where he teaches African American and U.S. history. In addition to teaching, Dr. Robinson holds the position of a visiting fellow in equity, justice, and inclusion at the University of Oregon's Clark Honors College. Dr. Robinson's research stands as a testament to his dedication to uncovering pivotal moments in history. His focus on the civil rights and uncovering and Black Power movements in the Pacific Northwest has provided invaluable insights into a region often overlooked in these critical discussions. Notably, he has recently released Washington State Rising, Black Power on Campus in the Pacific Northwest. He places this corner of the country within broader context of the civil rights movement. Within the pages of his book, Dr. Robinson shed lights on the activism and substantial contributions of the Black Student Union in Washington State to overarching movement. By exploring this often neglected aspect of history, he brings to the forefront the stories and struggles of those who played a vital role in shaping our society. As we welcome Dr. Robinson back, we eagerly anticipate this discussion. Please join us in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Marc. Thank you, guys. Let's get started.
Testing. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Ari, for your lovely introduction. We'll welcome. Can we give another round of applause to Dr. Marc? Now, we had some conversations with Marc, and Marc asked us to not give him hard questions, so we're going to give him hard questions, right? I think to get started, just to warm us up, Marc, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do for those in the audience that don't know.
Sure. Well, how much time do I have? I mean, I start out by saying I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so born and raised in Seattle, Washington. Went to Wazoo as an undergraduate, so my very beginning of my college career was here. So I was here for a little bit, 1 year, and then I transferred. That was in 2000, came back in 2007 as a grad student. So from 2007, I was a student, then I was a full-time staff person, 2012, and ended up having a position here until right about 2016. So all that I think is about 9 years stint. I was here in Pullman. Got to do a lot of cool stuff, work with a lot of great people, my fellow grad students, my faculty, my colleagues that I worked with. A lot of great memories. Appreciate so many great people here, and so it's wonderful to be back. Currently, as the introduction said, I'm in Southern California, California State University, San Bernardino. I teach in the history department, and so I get to obviously be in the classroom, but also kind of have a hand in some of our other programming on campus around African American history or around student retention or other kind of success initiatives. So I guess happy to say more about any of that kind of stuff. But I really appreciate all of you for being here. Thanks for coming through the snow and coming to join us. Hope you're having a great day. But yeah, thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course.
It seems like you've been everywhere and you've done so many things, amazing things. And a book like this, to me, in my definition, is revolutionary. We don't see many books like this that explain the history, the Black history of Washington State, or especially WSU or Seattle. So I wanted to know what inspired you to make this book. What was the defining moment in which you decided that you wanted to make a book centering everything around Washington State?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple answers. On the one hand, writing a book was daunting. Was something that if you had talked to me, 10, 20 years ago and said you're gonna write a book someday, I would have been like, nah, that's not gonna. Like, especially when I was an undergrad, that seemed like a dream that would never come true. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's an example of you go on a journey, you take one step, and you do the best you can, and that leads to another step, and you never know where it may lead you. So, hopefully that's something we could all sort of feel connected to and motivated by. The research itself kind of started out, as a student with curiosity. So as both an undergrad and grad student, I didn't necessarily see a book, but I was interested in learning about, what was the history of African American struggle in politics in my own hometown, my home state, kind of where I was going to school. Learning about what was happening around the country in this 1960s was interesting. Thinking about the different kinds of struggles and organizations that existed. All that, I was a student activist myself, so it was sort of connected to what I was involved in and what I was interested in. But I really wasn't seeing much in my history books about what happened in the Pacific Northwest, in the state of Washington. And so I started, asking around and, kind of doing a little bit of digging. And then so undergrad paper eventually grew into a dissertation, a PhD dissertation, eventually then grew into, an article then grew into the book. So, it was sort of this process that started with just a genuine curiosity. And then one other thing, as I started to learn and kind of dig into some of my own curiosities, then I felt a responsibility to share what I had learned, and to not just sort of keep it to myself, like, oh, this is interesting, I want to tell people. So then that was also a motivator for kind of keep working at it and keep kind of building on it.
No, that's really, what you've done is so important. In fact, you touched on it a little bit. Getting access to our information, right, our history can be so difficult. So I imagine, in the book you have some anecdotal stories. It seems like you interviewed some people, you did your research. How difficult was it, or I guess, what was your perception on how to get access to the information for the book?
It's a mix. It's certainly, as you said, right, it's kind of interviewing people who had been students in the 1960s, accessing archives. Unfortunately, some of those people have passed away now. And so I was kind of fortunate and blessed to be able to talk to them when I could and get some of their stories. And so, as time goes on, I think that's one of the difficulties, is trying to find people who are willing to share. All due respect to those who choose not to, but sometimes I remember running up into some folks who were hesitant to share some of their experiences because of maybe it was a sensitive topic, maybe controversial. It may impact their current lives or their professions, and so there can be some sensitivity around that. Fortunately, though, I would say, kind of on the flip side, I was able to kind of get great help from our library here on campus and the archives. Marco English is a name that I'll mention, who I worked with quite a bit, who was very helpful. But others in the archives here, also at the University of Washington, their library system, has a collection of quite a bit of material. So for anyone who's interested, my sense is that there's a lot more stories to be told, and by kind of identifying what's already available and accessing some of those documents and some of those records, I'm sure there's lots of great books waiting to be written that maybe some of you may write. So, so in a certain sense, the information is not readily available. You can't just like Google it necessarily, but it's there, and with a little bit of digging and maybe some help, you can find it.
Absolutely. I really appreciated your honesty in your writing. You would say things like, this president helped in this way, but that's not to take away from the BSU's effort. And what they did helped and created what the president said and dictated their actions. I found that very inspirational. And then also your just opposing positions with Jim Crow South and as well as the North. For those who haven't read your book just yet, would you like to explain what the Jim Crow North and South would be and the differences between that? Or the similarities more so?
Sure. So, great question. I wanted to.
We got right into it.
Sorry, your questions aren't so good. I'm sorry. I'm just kidding. Yeah, just trying to. Okay, so on your first point, I just wanted to say the Terrell Mall, right? So Glenn Terrell was the president of WSU during the period of time that I studied, and Glenn Terrell was one of these folks who deserves credit to a degree for being open and being willing to hear the grievances and even enact policies in some cases. But as I tried to say in the book, it was the students and their allies who were pushing and making the arguments that motivated officials to take positions that were supportive or at least cooperative. So I think there's an important, that's an important point that you raised there. So thank you for that. In terms of the second part of your question, Jim Crow North, right? So when it comes to the history of the United States in the 1960s, 70s, civil rights movement and so forth, as I'm sure we all know, a lot of the attention is on the South, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. And there's a focus on how a racial system of inequality and oppression, oftentimes referred to as Jim Crow, was deeply entrenched in the South. Manifested in everything from voter discrimination to outright violence and economic oppression and so forth. So that's an important part of our history about of the American South. What's oftentimes not talked about as much is that it wasn't just a Southern problem. That there were similar policies, similar attitudes, sometimes discrimination and barriers that were subjected or imposed on African Americans and other people of color in the North. And so other scholars have sort of talked about Jim Crow North as this part of the larger history, even if not as sort of, as they say, in your face, or maybe not as severe as in parts of the South, still strong enough that it could impact your life, restrict your opportunities, maybe even question your safety, and so forth. And so Jim Crow North is this concept that's talked about in the field of history. What I tried to do is sort of connect that to the Pacific Northwest, and particularly with the story of WSU and kind of rural Eastern Washington. We definitely see the students that were protesting were facing death threats. We're facing the potential for law enforcement kind of aggressive actions, prosecutions, all kinds of kind of day-to-day interactions that were hostile or prejudicial, and so it wasn't just a Pullman problem, of course. I mean, we can think about what's happening across the region, but really trying to make a comment in the broader historiography, saying that the Jim Crow North also applied to the state of Washington, is sort of making that connection, and saying that many of these attitudes and some of the policies that went along with them were also present in the state of Washington.
I'll add on to that and say kind of the modern take on that now we see is conservative racism versus liberal racism. And to kind of touch on the points of, the protests that were occurring and how students in Washington we're seeing racial discrimination, prosecution, arrests, so on, during the 1960s. And in your book, you take time to highlight how 1968 was a very big year, because that year we lost MLK. John F. Kennedy was also assassinated. There were tensions with the Vietnam War. At the same time, May of 1968, BSU was trying to get established. And at the same time, over at UW, we see the protests at the president's office. So could you go in depth about how 1968 was a year for the state of Washington, both at UW and WSU?
Sure. Yeah, 1968. It's an important year. In part, I think of it as it built off of a number of incidents that happened, sort of leading up to that, right? So, we have, the Black Power movement, which arguably, first hits the mainstream, say 65, 66, but it's really kind of at a height in 68. As you said, Dr. King's assassination. Of course, Robert F. Kennedy, who's running for president, was assassinated that year. His brother John F. Kennedy had been assassinated some years earlier. And whenever I talk to folks about this period, they always emphasize the degree to which the Vietnam War provides this kind of overall context, sometimes kind of rumbling in the background, sometimes more in the forefront. But even people who are calling for racial reform, people who are calling for greater enrollment or so forth, the Vietnam War was always a part of their consciousness. The Black Student Union was always opposed to the war, and that's also part of this kind of building set of tension. So by 1968, then we have a lot of things sort of coming together. Specifically in Washington, as you mentioned, there's stuff happening at the University of Washington, confronting their president and trying to push for reforms. Really, at the same time, there's stuff happening at Washington State University, and really kind of all over, universities all over the country, pushing for Black studies, pushing for reforms to the admission process, pushing for greater faculty of color, trying to address the prejudices and the racism of people's attitudes. That's sort of, it's sort of, as one person told me, it's kind of in the air at the time, right? On campuses, in society, and abroad. So I think, all that kind of comes to Pullman too, and maybe that's the part that people may not always expect, is that, what I tried to show is that, the state of Washington and Pullman in particular was not immune or was not detached from these broader social trends, whether it be, as I said, confronting police misconduct or trying to address, the lack of Black enrollment, that there were folks who were speaking out and stepping up in ways that that was they were doing it here as well as they were doing elsewhere.
Absolutely. You spent a portion of your book talking about the civil rights movement as well as the Black Power movement. And you made this statement that really stuck with me, that we see CRM or the Black Power movement as kind of one continuous kind of movement that doesn't have any pauses or halts or difference in ideology. At least when we go to school and we're taught it, it's taught as very much the same blanketed statement of Black people fighting for rights, but we don't really get into why or how they fought for those rights. Do you think that it's important to differentiate and contextualize the difference between the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement? And if not, why?
Yeah, I think it's important to differentiate and contextualize. But it's also complicated, right? Because there is a value in identifying continuity and kind of thinking about how one struggle or one kind of element of a larger struggle connects, how they connect to each other, right? So for instance, World War II and some of the large migrations of African Americans to places like the Pacific Northwest or to other places that were industrializing for the war, there's a connection between that shift that's happening in the 1940s and then the growth of the civil rights movement and then Black Power movement in the kind of 50s and 60s. And so I think as, you know, as students of history, it's important to kind of recognize how one thing connects to each other, and things don't just pop out of nowhere. Like, you know, it doesn't just emerge in a vacuum. But yeah, with civil rights and Black Power in particular, they did have sort of key differences. You know, in particular, you know, as an example, well, back up for a second. So part of what's important, I think, in recognizing the two is that we oftentimes get this very celebratory narrative of one, civil rights, and we hear very little to nothing, or perhaps negative description of Black Power on the other hand. I remember, you know, for me, when I was growing up, I heard a ton about King's speech, I have a dream, you know, maybe civil rights movement here and there. Heard very little about, you know, Black Power movement, Black Panthers, Black Student Union. If anything, maybe in my family, there would be, someone might mention something at the dinner table or Christmas time or something, but very little at all. So part of, I think, is being able to sort of put both on the map and kind of seeing how they work together, or, you know, how they existed at the same time. So what I was going to say then is, if we sort of recognize that they both were important, the differences, right? So you know, the civil rights movement at heart is an integrationist sort of movement, right? It's a movement that is geared towards trying to gain, for African Americans to gain access to the mainstream institutions, you know, economic opportunities, and so forth of American society, right? So, you know, housing, education, you know, employment, et cetera. African Americans are trying to gain access to spaces that are already powerful or already privileged. Black Power, on the other hand, instead of being integrationist, is more focused around self-sufficiency, right? So it's geared towards African Americans trying to either build or identify or strengthen the ways in which they collectively can ensure their own success, sort of provide their own opportunities, right? So, you know, whereas one maybe is trying to get a job at the local grocery store, or the local, you know, business. Civil rights, trying to get the job at the business. Black Power, let's start our own business and build, you know, economic opportunities for ourselves, or have our own kind of employment opportunities. Those sort of differences and the various strategies and kind of rhetoric that come from that make the two different in important ways. You know, I think that they're ultimately striving at some of the same goals, but they have different lessons that we can draw from them today. So I think that's important.
That's a really good point. And there's definitely a stigma. So, okay, oops. Hello. There we go. I think we're back. You know, I was going to add, there's definitely a stigma between the two, because also growing up, you know, heard a lot about Martin Luther King and the speech, but you don't hear much about Fred Hampton or Malcolm X and their stories of the freedom fighters, right? And it kind of tells you that, in a way, there is a certain agenda almost that is more favored than the other. And like you said, one is about self-sufficiency, whereas the other is more about integration, right? And one thing, you know, Amina and I were talking about is that a lot of these organizations came out from a need, right? The students at the UW chapter were able to go to the California conference, and from there that sparked them to be able to want to start a BSU on their campus. And also with the height of racial tensions going on at the time, that there's an implicit need for a community and an organization to support Black people. But as we stand during modern times, students are coming in, and there's almost a question of how can we sustain these organizations which were built by our parents' generations or grandparents' generation. as students, though we don't see the same push or pull factors as the previous generation saw. How do you see it as someone who studies history, as the modern youth embark on taking over these institutions and trying to maintain them? What are some of your experiences as a faculty in that sort?
Good question. Good question. All right, that one makes me. I guess good question means I have to think for a moment. Okay, but it is a good question. Yeah, you did. I think, in some ways, I have maybe like multiple answers, and so to try not to be too long-winded, maybe I'll just sort of pick one or two, because I think there's a historian's answer to that question, and then there's like an activist kind of answer to that question, and maybe others. Yeah, I mean, as a historian, I think that there's a value in kind of maintaining institutions over time, documenting, what's been done in the past, saving records, investing in the collection and the honoring of the past, collection of the evidence, and then the honoring of the past. So I think there's a value in as students, the degree to which you all step up into leadership roles and take on the president or the historian or the secretary for these organizations. I think you're to be commended for that. I think that's it's fantastic, and we certainly I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the way in which students continue to kind of step up in that way. And so that's work, though, right? And in the way in which it's work, it could be compensated in some ways, particularly if you are kind of carrying something forward on behalf of the institution. And so I guess that kind of takes me to my activist kind of answer, is that it's perfectly natural for organizations to be born, to live, and to pass away, and to be replaced by other iterations of coming together. When the students, created the BSU in 1968, they were reflecting their own times. They were responding to their particular needs. And if those particular needs are different now, then it may be understandable that it would be a different kind of, organization or a different style of coming together, and that things would evolve and change over time. And so I think it's perfectly understandable, and I guess maybe we as the older folks, should give the students the space to decide what works best for them now, and not say you have to do it the same way it was done 50, 60 years ago. And then let the creativity flow, right? It's not like the activists of the 60s had everything figured out and had a game plan. They were trying this, trying that. Some things worked. They switched strategies. There was trial and error. There was, maybe some mistakes that were made. Some things maybe they would do differently. But, they were bold, and they were, studied and prepared, and, they took action. And I have every reason to believe that, modern day students can do the same thing, right? Trial and error, be bold, study up, take action, and figure out, what works today. And so, yeah, sort of I'm kind of torn between, on the one hand, there's a value in kind of maintaining a legacy, for what we can learn from it and the value of it, but also not wanting it to be like this burden that you sort of can't sort of move out of that, because, the next 60 years are going to be about, what works now and kind of what you guys want to do with it.
So speaking in your book, you speak about surveillance, and it's often really difficult to speak out when you feel as though the admin might be retaliatory against you, or they might respond in a way that's very negative. You spoke about instances with the dean or the deans of schools, in which they responded in a more respectful manner than I feel like most would. What steps would you advise students to take before speaking out, considering that you are an activist and were an activist and grew up being an activist? Just from your personal experience, what steps should we take before speaking out?
I think that I hesitate to answer because on the one hand, it's important to recognize the specifics of the struggle and what people are going through. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly kind of what's the particular context of Wazoo at this moment. So, forgive me. But with that being said, respecting those who are already kind of in the fight, a couple of thoughts that come to mind. I think one thing that I learned over time is that it's really helpful to try to identify who your allies are, as you begin, or maybe as you kind of get going. And sometimes it's an ally in terms of in a strategic area, right? So maybe this administrator so-and-so may not be cooperative in all aspects, but if there's a certain kind of goal that we're trying to achieve, maybe we're trying to get money for some kind of program, or we're trying to, get space for a certain event, and we know that, Professor Robinson is very supportive when it comes to us getting space, then, identifying that and kind of working that connection as best you can, and so on and so forth, right? So if you can kind of figure out kind of where you can get some support and kind of take that as far as you can get it, then the more kind of confrontational tactics sometimes maybe are unnecessary or can be sort of held off for another day. I think sometimes I remember, again, speaking from my own experience, for folks who are activists, there was a tendency to kind of want to start kicking down doors as like step one, like,
Oh, for sure.
you start and you're like, all right, we're gonna take over the administration, or we're gonna, show them we're serious, or we're gonna, kick up dust and so forth. And there's a time and a place, but I think what I've sort of recognized in hindsight is that it's like sometimes you might want to hold off on that tactic and see what you can get, and then maybe sort of bring the more sort of confrontational tactics, down the road. So I think that's. I mean, the other thing I guess I'll add too from my research is I think there's a really strong value in being in community in a sense, and so by that I mean for the Black Student Union that I write about, they were very intentional about as best they could being in relationship to members of the kind of off-campus community, maybe their extended family or friends, folks back home, or folks in kind of grassroots organizations, and we're able to kind of build this set of relationships and collaborations between folks who are pushing for change off campus and those who are pushing for change on campus. And I think that ended up creating quite a bit of additional kind of power to the student voice when they did have to confront, folks who are, being resistant. To the degree that makes sense, forging those kinds of alliances and collaborations kind of on and off campus, I think also can be really helpful for students to think about.
That's a really good point. And, in your book, you talked about how in 1968, there were only 200 Black students on the campus of WSU, and there were 14,000 students in total. So in context, that's 1 in 70 students were Black. Now, in 2021, that's the most recent statistic I could get, but as of now, we're sitting about around 900 Black students on campus with over 31,000 students in total. So for context, that's 1 in 35. So we've cut the numbers, we've doubled the numbers in theory, if you think about it like that. So, you know, when you talk about building community here, I feel the actions of the past have done well in reflecting in the future, as now we have a stronger community. You know, in your book, when, you know, this part really made me feel that kind of way, when you're talking about the 44 high school students that came on campus and were called racial slurs. These are high school students, right, interested in going to college. And to come on a space and you're not welcomed as a high school student can be very intimidating. And at the time, you know, very discouraging to go to college even. But now I can say as a member of the VIBES program, which is Visionaries Empowering Black Students, which brings high school students on campus, I see the difference being a part of that program, knowing that was the case in the past, and now we accept high school students and they enjoy the campus and they feel a sense of community here and they're able to feel welcomed and come back on campus once they graduate and go to college. It speaks volumes on the importance of community and the actions of the past, right? And kind of the maintenance of that. And to your point, taking diplomatic approaches rather than purely aggressive approaches can be a good strategy moving forward, I think, for, as you know, us, the youth and the students look to take over the work that's been done by the past. So I just wanted to add on to that. A question I wanted to ask you, though, is, you know, we are Cougs at the end of the day. We know you are a dog. You did go to UW and you went to WSU, so you might be a little conflicted. We'll have to talk about the Apple Cup later on. But how did you see the difference historically between what the BSU at WSU was facing versus the BSU at University of Washington?
So they were very, well, on the one hand, they were quite connected. And so one thing that I found quite surprising to me, even as I was researching it, is that, you know, even in a time without smartphones and without, you know, email and so forth, the kind of activist Black students at UW, those at Wazoo, even those in sort of Bay Area, California, and into, you know, Oregon, and, you know, even on down the West Coast, were able to maintain pretty strong connections of traveling to each other's campuses, sometimes writing letters or other kind of correspondences, connected with like networks of like organizations. So, you know, I was talking to, you know, one of the folks who, when I was signing books, Bo, I remember your name, and asked me about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Well, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, another organization of the time, was this connective tissue in it, or a connective organization that connected activists in Seattle to those who were in California, to those who were in, you know, Atlanta, Georgia, or, you know, in Montgomery, Alabama, and so forth. And so, you know, some folks sort of brought those pre-existing relationships to Pullman or to Seattle or, you know, to the Northwest. So there was a lot of these connections. So on the one hand, to your question, you know, the Black students at different institutions were well connected, knew about what each other were doing, shared strategies, tactics, and so forth. You know, many of the folks who were students were from the same neighborhoods that they grew up in. Maybe they went to the same high schools, or they knew each other from younger years. So there's a lot of kind of connection. You know, of course, in Pullman as well, right? Being that it's kind of isolated, it can kind of act as a bit of a motivation to sort of focus inward. And, you know, in terms of, you know, if you're on campus, if you're a Black student, you know, if you want to get involved, you want to get connected, your community is on campus. You know, you want to go to a dance, there's probably going to be with folks who are dancing on campus, or, you know, people who you know from those connections. And so that kind of dynamic really encouraged this kind of collective coming together dynamic here. That was also present at the University of Washington, but not to the same degree. So in terms of a main difference, right? The fact that you had the Central District, this historically black neighborhood, not far from the University of Washington campus, or you had this sort of broader kind of metropolis of black churches and organization, yeah, different kind of places to kind of get connected. That then has a way of creating a different dynamic, for the students who are at the University of Washington. So I think the context is maybe different in terms of that. And then I also would say the activists at this institution faced a greater degree of repression than those who were in the University of Washington. Not to say that it was all good in Seattle and there was no racism there too, but the degree to which the potential for like white supremacist violence that came up without even really asking, just sort of as I talked to people, they would kind of mention that as part of the story. It would come up in the records. It certainly sort of jumped out in a way that it didn't when I was looking at the University of Washington. And so, the kind of larger context of Eastern Washington / Northern Idaho and kind of this kind of region and the way in which that kind of affected the reception or the openness to this kind of Black power presence, that also made a difference. And it is, in a sense, it reflects the courage that students had here, that they were able to push for change just like their counterparts everywhere. Arguably, it was more risky here than it may have been elsewhere.
So much. You asked us not to ask you any hard questions, but you're knocking them out of the park so far. Truly. And that's all the time we have for today. And so if you guys want to we can open up the floor and you guys can ask questions. So whenever you guys are ready.
Yeah. And I'll walk over to you with the mic if you have a question, so just raise your hand.
So unfortunately, yesterday we couldn't do the archive tour, which we really wanted to do, but something that my colleagues and I, first of all, Carrie Bullock Ben Israel, Director of TRIO Student Support Services. One of the conversations my colleagues and I have had in Access and Opportunity lately is what the process is for archiving and what needs to be in there. So one of the questions I have is, what do you wish we would have archived to help your story?
And I think this is a very important question, especially after taking the tour of the archives last Friday with Marc, because Marc English, who's right back here, it was very fascinating, and I'm upset we didn't get to go yesterday, but he said that there's like going to be a time period because of the changeover in technology and stuff like that, and people wanting to save everything on thumb drives and stuff like that, that things aren't getting to the archives anymore. So it's really important. And so what is it that we need to get there? What should we be putting in the archives? Like she said, that was an amazing question.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have experts in the room, so, perhaps I could defer to folks who do archiving for a living. But I mean, one thing that I remember when I was heading the MLK program for a bit, trying to document like what had been done in the past in terms of the various speakers and the various events, and just trying to find like a clear record of like posters that had been produced, or the committee members, or kind of who, it didn't have to be necessarily super detailed, but just like a kind of list of or a record of sort of collection, of kind of what had been done. I think that kind of stuff is useful. In terms of, for the students, the Black Student Union and other organizations, yeah, I mean, having, as best as can be done, the collection of, I'm used to having sort of documents, right? So flyers or a list of officers' names. Nowadays, even like a print off of the website would probably be relevant. Having a record of what it looked like, or what were the different kind of people involved at the time. So those kinds of things. I mean, it's a challenge to know what to say because you can't save everything, right? And it can be overwhelming. But at least being able to kind of trace, what's happening sort of year to year and kind of who's involved. I think that would be the main thing that I would think about. Yeah.
And I know for me, I'm the Black Student Union PR, and we produce flyers, and now we have a system called Presence where we actually document every single person that goes to the club or that signs in with the QR code. So thankfully, hopefully in about 40 years, historians won't have to worry about things like that anymore because we have it documented, thankfully.
So that archiving is so important because as the president of the National Society of Black Engineers, looking for previous records from the organization has been so difficult. In fact, even just from 2 or 3 years ago, like before I was on the campus, is so hard. So the importance of archiving is something that is necessary, and we shouldn't have to be trying to track down alumni who graduated, 19 something, just to get a picture of what NSBE looked like. So, good point.
Okay, and we have another question from one of my amazing cab members who really loved the book and was super excited to meet you.
Hello, my name is Siju. I'm for BSU, I'm Vibes co-chair. I'm one of the Vibes co-chairs, and I'm also president for the newly formed People of Color Pre-Law Association. So I just took a lot of notes on my phone while I was reading. And then one thing that just stuck to me was because I know that we started taking like programs for like Black education, stuff like that, like Black studies. And we don't do it anymore now, like they're all gone. So, and I did look into some classes that were being taken that they used to take those days, and now like none of them are here anymore. So, how do you feel about that? Like us not doing stuff like that anymore? Because I feel like it's really important.
Yeah. So in terms of Black studies on this campus and many campuses, at one point there was a Black studies department on our campus. Then there was a kind of downsizing or I guess merging into an ethnic studies department, and I think there was further changes, and now there's a department or school of languages, race, languages, and cultures, I think, something like that. Forgive me for maybe missing the name. So I think maybe the good news is that I think there's still people doing good work. I think there's still students and faculty who are teaching courses related to African American history, Black studies, critiques of injustice, and so forth. But I think that the loss of these programs is a loss as well. And I think that there's an opportunity, or I guess we should also reflect on kind of what it would take, or what's been lost, and how we can sort of maybe either regain or sort of adjust, in response to that. I remember, when I was a student here, some of the conversation that I remember hearing was this kind of perception that this was sort of during the Obama years, that we didn't need Black studies anymore. We didn't need ethnic studies because we were past that, right? Post-racial and all that stuff. And I think that was some of the things that were maybe expressed by folks on campus. if the last few years have done nothing else, they've sort of demonstrated that, there's still lots to be taught and things to share. And so, I remember fondly women's studies on our campus department. I remember fondly, our ethnic studies and Black studies. Even when I was here, it wasn't a department. It still had a much more visible presence on our campus. And so I think there's a reason, there's a conversation to be had, or perhaps more thought to be given to that. But I also would add too, and I guess one thought is sort of directed towards how we hold those accountable who are in power, and kind of making some asking some tough questions. There's also the flip side of quick story. So at another institution, there were a group of students who were asking for Black studies or asking for a major, and they approached the dean of that, not here, somewhere else. They approached the dean and kind of made some demands, and the dean was receptive, but was kind of like, well, we got to find the money and so forth. And during the conversation, the dean asked these Black students who had come and were demanding Black studies, how many of you would major in Black studies if it existed? And there was a accounting major and an engineering major and a maybe a sociology or whatever. And the students basically had to admit that none of them probably would. Right, so I think there's a question about what does that mean? Like, what do we do with that? I think we should be kind of thoughtful and maybe forward-thinking, as if we did have Black studies again on our campus, the department, I would worry about, would there be the student demand? Would there be the amount of sustainable resources for it? And if not, I think there's another maybe invitation to be creative, to be sort of forward-thinking, and to say, well, maybe that model that existed in the 60s and 70s doesn't quite work, but it's still important to teach the topics and to have a space for Black students and others to engage in this way. And we're not seeing enough of those spaces on our campus now. So there's still work to be done, but it's about kind of maybe rethinking and reimagining what that looks like. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I sort of offer that as a comment on, how let's all sort of be courageous enough to be creative and think about, moving forward.
Yeah, I would like to add to that with that we know there's a threat to losing a certain demographic of classes and studies. That we should possibly, moving forward, go back and reflect on what we once had and what we currently have and what we want. And that's something that the BSU can, moving forward, highlight and maybe fight for. And also to leave for our future students that if that threat were to grow, to know what we had, where we were, and what to fight for. But CJ would like to follow up.
I was just gonna say, honestly, now that you said it, I don't really think I would major in it, just cause I just know for a fact that if I when I graduate, I'm not gonna get a job for majoring in Black studies. No one's gonna hire me. That's just how the world is. I would take it as a class, as a U-Core, which I really do think that it should be a U-Core for everyone, cause they're making us take. I don't know why I'm taking textiles right now. I want to be a lawyer, but I feel like we should. Make that a U-Core. And then it's really important because there's a lot, I know a lot of people think that, oh, we know a lot about Black history. There's so much that's hidden that we don't think about. I remember talking to my friend this one time about, wars that have happened in the past and like people trying to move, like for example, like the Holocaust, people trying to move, like there was literally like also black people carrying the loads off of those people that were trying to move, and we never actually think about that. So when we say like, oh, I know a lot about Black history, like there's so much deep-rooted stuff that we still do need to learn about. And there's obviously like no courses, like I said. So how do you think we should like go forward about that? Because honestly, I know the dean's probably tired of seeing my face now. So how do you think we should like, because it would be really nice if that's, I feel like that's something that every student really needs to learn. So how do you think we should go about that?
Yeah, how do we go about, addressing the lack of knowledge about Black history and so forth? Where do we begin? I mean, yeah, well, I mean, the fact that we have lots of, intelligent, folks like yourself, right? People who have bright futures and, analytical minds, who feel like Black studies is not a viable option as a career track, deserves to be pondered, right? Deserves to be questioned, I guess. I mean, clearly there's larger kind of economic and other social forces involved. But, there's, that shouldn't just be sort of taken as a given, right? I mean, it's the reality, but it can be struggled against and it can be addressed in some ways. Yeah, but in the meantime, in terms of like creating ways for folks to gain more knowledge about the African American experience, perhaps some of this is already happening, but the degree to which it can be built into other things that students are involved in, the degree to which it could be part of the textile department or part of the athletic department or part of the orientation system that we have here. I remember I remember talking to folks who were in residence life or talking to folks who were in different parts of the institution, who were interested and engaged on these topics and perhaps could be brought together in some kind of creative process to ensure that students are getting exposed, even if it's not in an undergrad major. So, I mean, that's one idea. I'm sure there are other ideas. There's probably great ideas in this room, but I think it comes back for me to think, if a department or a major, as it's structured now, requires a certain number of students to sort of sustain it. And so if there isn't that, certain number of students within that kind of framework, then there's got to be other creative ways to get the information. And one thing that happened, in the time period that I studied is that, there were students who kind of in that self-sufficient kind of philosophy, sought out information for themselves or shared information between each other, had, classes or teach-ins or other kinds of, educational opportunities that they themselves would kind of create and distribute. And so I think that's another way, maybe, thinking about that kind of Black power spirit in terms of like owning our own education and, trying to do it and maybe calling on the institution to support BSU or to support the Black Student Center to make sure that there is the resources to do that kind of work as well.
I just wanted to add, I used to minor in Black Studies when I attended the University of Oregon. Thankfully, they had an entire department, a very inclusive department. I know for me, I'm a political science major, so I could directly use my degree in political science. While learning about Black studies, you could never learn too much about Black history. Every single aspect of American life, every single government structure, housing, education, hospitals, everything surrounds itself off of Blackness, anti-Blackness, and Black history. So I personally do believe that if there was a big enough push, we can definitely use our Black degrees to maneuver through society. Because at the end of the day, things such as transportation also affect Black people. Things such as housing mostly affect Black people. So I would definitely be an advocate for getting Black studies here for sure.
To add, while it's not here formally, let's say, right, that shouldn't stop you from taking the individual effort to also learning your history as well. Because I myself, I'm an engineer, but I take it upon myself to study up on Black history and African history especially, because I'm of Ghanaian origin. So those individual efforts as well on your own initiative, because though Amina is a political science major and there's a connection there, I couldn't necessarily leverage an African studies minor with my electrical engineering degree. I don't know what company would do that. If they're hiring, great, I'll be first there. But the truth is, in corporate America and at the end of the day, you're trying to feed yourself, right? So it's not necessarily about, at the end of the goal, the problem is we just want to know our history. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to dedicate your entire life towards pursuing that history, but you should know it, right? You should know how it affected you, know how it impacted you, know how it brought you, your family, the institutions that are around you, it to be, right? And a lot of people are missing that. So I think that's, to point to what Siju's, talking about, I think it's important that we on our own as well should take it to try to learn a little bit more. If you don't know a certain aspect of your history, I recommend you take time to learn.
Kofi, your company.
You said?
Your company would do that.
my company? Really?
Yes. All right, we have another question right here.
Okay, definitely.
We have another question.
I'm hiring.
All right. Thank you so much. Tremaine Gaither, he, him. So there's this idea floating around in the Black community, especially among activists, that irks me to the dickens. It is this idea of Black purchasing power. Some of you may be familiar. The idea that, hey, we have $1.2 trillion in Black buying power, and if we just circulated that money within our community, we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? It gets on my last nerves, and it does have historical implications. I think that in some ways, the early 1970s, the Black Power movement kind of became this co-opted capitalist movement. It left the socialist ideas and it started promoting blaxploitation movies because we wanted representation. It promoted James Brown and different R&B artists. It promoted all of these other things. And I think it's even clothing and style, the Afro picks and things like that. I wonder, would you take a moment and talk about just the historical implications of that notion of Black buying power, where it came from, and how it's sort of relevant today?
Sure. So yeah, I think there's different levels to it. I mean, I think you're right to sort of point out there's this kind of capitalist kind of co-optation happening, but I think there's also more valuable elements as well. Before I say more, I want to come back to just the last point real briefly, just to think about how you mentioned that you're in engineering and that there isn't really space for a Black Studies minor with your engineering program. Understandable, and for anyone who chooses to major in something other than Black Studies or whatever, I don't look at you differently. No shame from me, because I understand, right? You got to make money. You know, your parents. A lot of things go into the decision. But my thought would be, there are engineering programs around the country, or accounting programs, or nursing programs, or pre-med, or whatever, where there is a deliberate attempt to engage social justice, American history, how do you sort of be culturally competent to, how do you address structural inequality, that whole range of conversations. There are programs that do that do incorporate those things in their engineering program. And if the one here does not, then there's a conversation to be had about, could there be some change, or could there be some adjustments made, some improvements? Arguably, if you want to be prepared to work in a global environment, one needs to be familiar with history, one needs to be familiar with different cultural and political experiences. Of course, there's all kinds of issues around sustainability and AI, and how that connects to equity and race and injustice and surveillance, and facial scans and all that kind of stuff, which is coded racially. And so it's not hard to think about how public health, or the STEM fields or whatever, should be and could be more intentionally engaged with issues that come from Black studies and ethnic studies and women's studies and similar disciplines. So, there's a potential there. Now, in terms of the co-optation and Black buying power, I mean, I think it, any good idea can be co-opted or can be, undermined, right? So I think at the root, if we think about it as this is an element to try to build a collective empowerment, even if limited, to say, trying to use economics to improve the position or improve the lives of Black folks, I think that's a good thing. So, using economic leverage, I mean, in some ways, the Montgomery bus boycott, which is celebrated as this important kind of win, was all about using economic leverage, choosing not to ride the bus, to then get the reform that we wanted, or some reforms on how we were being treated on the bus. And so I think sort of strategically employing economic leverage is, I think, what this kind of Black dollar circulation thing is at least trying to, or at some level, trying to access. And I think that can be a good thing. I mean, racial injustice is such a big problem that I think multiple strategies can and should be used simultaneously, or along the way. So, on the one hand, I think that there's a value in that as a strategy, but clearly, it's not going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to address it. We certainly can see how African Americans attaining wealth or status or political power does not in itself lessen attitudes about Black inferiority or white supremacy. It doesn't necessarily address broader systemic kinds of violences, right? I'm thinking about the new Jim Crow, and Michelle Alexander talks about how Barack Obama's election didn't necessarily help somebody who was sort of facing the criminal justice system, a Black person who was sort of being arrested and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think economics can be useful, but the idea that through just sort of being wealthier, that all sort of racial problems are going to go away, clearly that's not a useful direction to follow, I would say.
We have a question from Dr. Gaynor.
I hate to be that person, but this is more of a comment rather than a question. It hurt my heart just to hear some comments, about not. So I'm a historian. My office is literally across. I taught Caribbean history last spring, and the only Black student I had was a PhD student in the English department. Zach Williams teaches African American history. And people have lived and died dedicating their lives to Black history, not just African American history, but the African diaspora. We literally have Carter G. Woodson and the people who started Asala. It's really about paperwork and bureaucracy. I could literally go talk to other faculty and start a Black Studies minor to find out who's teaching particular courses around campus, and then propose a minor or a major. It's just, will there be students willing to take this course, I can develop a course and have it listed as a UCOR course, but I have to prove that there will be students, there will be enrollment. It's really about the paperwork and the time necessary to do these things. And yeah, I'm just biased because I'm a historian, but Black studies, again, is multidisciplinary. It's not just history, it's social sciences, sociology, poli-sci, anthropology, so many other things. So yeah, I guess there needs to be more connecting with the BSU and faculty on campus, and more effort on the departments to advertise and promote particular courses. I guess we just need to know that there's a demand. I know, just spending time with y'all this year, I didn't even know my first year that there were so many Black students. So I like hearing these things, so I know what I can do to better serve WSU's community. So yeah, just talk to us, Let us know that we're wanted or needed, and we can do these things together.
About cluster hires. So I don't know, anybody ever heard the term cluster hire? Okay, this university about 3 years ago, the administration took on the idea of cluster hire. It's a diversity initiative where you try to get people to teach about their culture that are from the culture. And there are 15 committed slots, 5 per year. Marlene Gaynor is one of them, right? Several of you have met and taken classes from those professors. There are 3 things when it comes to getting tenured, right? And that's the idea of these positions. They are monetary commitments to say, we will cultivate you to go through and stay here. Your research, your teaching, and your service is what we want most from you to get you through. My McNair scholars remember this, right? Those are the 3 things. So it's just not about you sitting in a seat taking a class. It is about us being here as faculty and staff and trying to multiply ourselves as well, so you can see yourselves. So you can know that you don't have to be me, but you know that you could be if you want to. And that's the point where we have to support each other. And that's the Black Power movement right there. You can't expect somebody to give you, the professor never gave you the thing, right? And the system is that. You've got to say, this is what we need. Let me show you how we're going to do it. And that means we have to over-communicate with each other about what that looks like. It also means, just because we make flyers and presents doesn't go into the archive. You've still got to give stuff over to the archive. And I say this as someone, honey, Lord knows. But the point is, guys, this is the thing. I would hope, and when one of you write this book 30 years from now, that you're able to see what our curriculum was, what some of the issues were, meeting notes from BSU, ASU, all the issues that we were facing. So we know that this isn't new. We struggled with this before, we got over it, we will struggle again. It is so, so important for those who come back that you mark your footprints hard so others can follow you, because then what's the point? So no matter what you do in life, do that everywhere you go. Always make sure you keep that story alive, because if you don't, they will kill you and tell you liked it. Zora Neale Hurston, right? Like that is, please make sure you mark that hard. So I just want to say, there is activities going on the faculty side of things in particular that are trying to make these solutions happen, but you got to take these classes and you got to learn about it.
Thank you.
One other thing real quick. So yes, take the classes. As I think I tried to say earlier, even though there's no longer a Black Studies department, there are good people on this campus teaching courses, doing good work, doing research, publishing books, articles. If you don't already know them, there's some sitting right here, definitely make those connections. And so ditto on all that. In addition, I want to add that if we also think about what are other ways that we could also make these connections, we talked about Vibes here earlier, wonderful program. Are the students involved in Vibes, are they compensated? And perhaps they should be. For the students that are here, how many of you guys have jobs on campus? Raise your hand real quick. Okay, so when you got your job on campus, perhaps there was some kind of human resources training or some kind of thing you had to learn, maybe something about academic records and keeping those secure, right? Could there be some kind of component of your on-campus job that includes you get paid to learn about Black history or to have some kind of one-on-one with a Black faculty member or to be able to do some kind of program? So that way you would have support that, even if you can't major in it, you could sort of, use some of your work hours in that way. It promotes the education that you're getting here as part of work study and so on and forth. I think those are sort of things that come to mind in terms of how you could potentially imagine, creating other support, other avenues that doesn't just depend on the kind of way it was done in the past.
I want to add on, I think this will be the last point most likely. Something I always say in conversations with people is the struggle we face is kind of a war on two fronts, right? We face external pressures, but we also face internal pressures, especially amongst the youth. Because like Dr. Gaynor said, in her passionate, telling, students aren't signing up for classes, right? And there's even low engagement. As a president of NSBE, there have been times we've had no one show up for meetings. It's been hard to pull engagement, And it's not like there isn't engineers who are Black on campus. They are. They have access to the meeting times, and we communicate with them, and we're putting our best foot forward, but they don't show up, right? And same could be said for BSU and any of the other orgs on campus. So the truth is, us as our generation in particular, we have to push, right? We have to, because if we do not do it, it will not be here in 40 years, right? That's just a fact. So, we can't allow ourselves to just sit back and be comfortable, because all the work that's been done in the past, as this book tells us, right? All the context that has built up to this moment, there were people who fought, who bled, and who died to build and establish what we have today. And it's our job to keep that going, so.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more back here.
I work on campus, and a lot of people who have spoken also worked on campus. And I've been working in higher ed for 18 years, and I'll tell you students one thing that will help you to kind of move things forward. Your voices are way more powerful than ours are. If you want something done, the administration will listen to you faster than they will listen to me. So if you want things to change, it's on you to be the tip of that spear, and then we can get behind you and push you forward. but you have to advocate for that for yourself. That's the most powerful thing you have is your voice, and you have to use it. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you everybody so much for attending and joining Dr. Robinson's presence. And I would like to say that I really appreciate the work and research that you put into this book and for sharing it with us and for highlighting these stories and giving us the possibility and the opportunity to connect with our history and to know our history of our presence here and to connect us to the past leaders. And all this does is show us, like Kofi says, we are the present leaders, and that in the next 30 years, our names might be in this book next. So this really helps us to connect with what had happened, what is happening, and what we need to do to not only remember to honor this, and it also helps us connect with our positions. We're in the presence of many leaders in this room. We have Black Women's Caucus, we have Black Men Making a Difference, we have our African Diaspora Association, we have our God's Harmony. We have grown. We're about 9 organizations now, and we will continue to grow, and we'll continue to prosper, and we will keep making these things to work for our future and our legacy. And so I want to thank you for your work in connecting us to what we had. Yeah. In the introduction to this book on page 3, Dr. Robinson connected us with the Evergreen Ngawa. And so I would like to end with the rally chant of Ngawa. So I'm going to say bing bing. Can you repeat it after me? So I'm going to say bing bing, bang bang, Ngawa, Black Power. I would also like to remind everybody about the Martin Luther King Award ceremony that will be taking place in the senior ballroom just across the way from here at 6 p.m. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.